So I'd like to welcome everyone to our focused conversation with growth and development stakeholders in Moncton to talk about the urban growth strategy. This is a really important aspect of the team's engagement strategy, and we're really happy that everybody has carved out a bit of time this evening to talk to us about the project. My name is Donna Hind. I'm helping the team with everything related to communications and engagement. I am going to ask you to keep an eye on your mic and just make sure it's muted so we don't get background noises. And I will mute you if I don't see the mute going on. So welcome. I'd like to make a couple of introductions, and then I'm going to turn it over to Bill from the city to give just a few words of welcome. So I introduced myself. Also on the call is Eric from Watson Associates, who's leading the charge on the urban growth strategy, and he's going to make the bulk of the presentation this evening. After the presentation, we'll open it up for conversation. We've got lots of time set aside to hear from everybody on the call. Maybe I can introduce Bill Budd from the city of Moncton. He's going to give a few words of introduction. Also on the call is Andrew from the city of Moncton, Andrew Smith. Maybe just wave, yep, who's managing the project and doing a terrific job collaborating with the team. So over to you, Bill. Do you want to just say hello to everyone? Oh, just need you to unmute.
Sorry about that.
There you go. Oh, there you go. Perfect.
Can you hear me okay now?
We are all good. Yep.
Okay, so bienvenue, welcome everyone. I think we're very fortunate. We have many leaders in our development industry across the city who help build our city on the call today, and some significant landowners and property owners that also contribute to building the city. So tonight we're going to get a bit of an overview of where we're going with the urban growth strategy from Watson and Associates in the planning partnership. And we're looking for your input because this strategy is intended to guide development over the next 25 years. So your input is really appreciated. I want to thank you. I'll turn it back to you, Donna. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks so much, Bill. Okay, so let's get started with the purpose of this session today. It's to set a little bit of context about the city's growth trends, the foundation that's laid by the municipal plan. We're going to talk a little bit about the city's urban structure, present the growth projections, and then have lots of time for conversation with everybody on the call. A little bit about why we're doing an urban growth strategy. It's because Moncton is experiencing lots of growth, as I'm sure many of you on the call have firsthand experience with this. It's now the largest and fastest growing municipality in all of New Brunswick. The urban growth strategy is going to provide a clear direction on where and how to plan for more places to live and work in the city over the next 25 years. Growth can occur by developing in downtown, by building new neighborhoods in currently undeveloped areas, by intensifying existing neighborhoods, and then intensifying development in existing smaller centers along corridors that have existing shops and businesses. The purpose of the growth strategy is to decide where and how residential and employment growth should occur over 25 years. It's to forecast growth and development and to assess various citywide and local growth scenarios, in part by understanding the cost of various scenarios. We want to understand the short and the long-term benefits and liabilities for the growth scenarios, because this will form the foundation for the next municipal plan review that's anticipated to occur in 2022. The work that we're doing will also be used to update and be aligned with other strategic documents of the city. So just where the work that we're doing on the urban growth strategy fits within the context of the city's other strategies and plans. The highest in the food chain is the city's municipal plan. Here we are, the urban growth strategy. The municipal plan also includes secondary plans that are embedded into that municipal plan. Those secondary plans are completed for the core and for various neighborhood areas. The city also has a strategic plan, and then a whole host of non-statutory plans and strategies that cover a full gamut of topics, from transportation to the environment to economic and tourism. We've come to understand that the urban growth strategy is really important to people that live and work in Moncton, because it helps to shape the future form of the city. It addresses the need for residential and employment lands, and it will affect the long-term environmental and financial viability of the city. I've had lots of conversations over the last couple of months with various individuals and community groups. We've been working in partnership with our city staff team, trying to connect with as many people as we possibly can. And we've heard a lot so far. We've heard a lot about specific locations for growth within the city limits. We've heard people talk about an interest in complete communities, in the notion of strong towns, in looking at planning through a gender lens, and making sure we're planning for the broadest diversity of people that choose to make Moncton their home. People have talked about affordable housing for seniors, for students, for families. People have mentioned the need to place Moncton within a bigger context and look at it within a regional planning perspective. Lots of people love the downtown and talked about it as a focus for intensification, for new green space parks, urban squares, for more urban amenities. Almost everyone talks about sustainability, protecting natural areas, talking about ideas for green infrastructure, talking about a concern for how the city manages stormwater, and then mobility. People say, I'd love to ride my bike more often. I'd love to be able to walk to more places, and to make sure that everything the city is doing is accessible by people of all abilities. So I'm going to toss it over to Eric, ask you to turn your mic on, Eric, and just take the group through a little bit about setting the context.
Great, thank you, Donna. This conversation regarding long-term growth potential and understanding how growth will be accommodated over a longer-term period is quite an involved task. And that really requires us to take a step back and really understand the city of Moncton through a broader regional context, and also to look at where the city has been over the past number of decades with respect to growth and development trends. So the city is really part of a much broader metropolitan area known as Greater Moncton. It's actually the fastest growing census metropolitan area in Atlantic Canada, having achieved a population growth rate of about 1.4% annually over that 10-year period. So the city is part of this broader region, which includes the towns of Riverview and Dieppe, as well as a number of parishes and villages that make up the broader region. So it's very much an urban as well as a rural composition. What's also important to recognize is that the Greater Moncton area has experienced relatively strong population and employment growth relative to the rest of New Brunswick. Over the past 5 years, the Greater Moncton area has achieved a growth rate of about 1.7%, which has been about 3 times higher in terms of the population growth rate compared to the provincial average. And the city of Moncton is a very important part of this broader regional market. It represents about 50% of the population base and accounts for 2/3 of the employment base. So over the past 15 years, Moncton has seen its population base increase by about 20%, growing from about 66,000 in 2006 to about 80,000 in 2021. Moncton has a relatively young age profile compared to the provincial average. Average age of residents in Moncton in 2016, based on the census, was about 41 years of age compared to 46 years of age for the provincial average. Having said that, the age structure of the city is changing. It is becoming older, with about 36% of the population over the age of 55. And this is where the city has seen the strongest growth by age group. Moncton has a very diverse housing base, about 34,400 occupied housing units based on our estimate in 2021. So this is about a 24% increase from 2006. As I mentioned, this is very diverse. We have about 53% of those units are low density. Then this would be comprised of single and semi-detached units. Another 10% of housing units are medium density, and these would include towns and row houses. And then about 33%, or about 1/3, are high density units in the form of apartments, both low, mid, high rise. And this could be in the form of either owner occupied condominium type units or then rentals. Overall, the housing mix is comprised of about 59% owner occupied versus 41% which are renter occupied. Part of the conversation in understanding the Moncton's existing profile extends beyond just looking at population and housing, but also understanding employment trends in the city. So the city's employment base is about 54,400 in 2021, represents about a 7% increase from 2006. The employment base spans a range of commercial, industrial, and institutional sectors, including retail, food and accommodation, finance and insurance, as well as educational and health services, as well as public administration being some of the larger sectors represented in the city. One important note is that the economy is gradually shifting to a greater share of service-based sectors. Many of those are in those commercial and institutional sectors that I mentioned. And this is a trend that we've observed more broadly in the Canadian context. With respect to non-residential development activity, over the past decade, the city has seen about $24.3 million in activity annually. Over that 10-year period, it's come across in a range of sectors that have been accommodated, both industrial, commercial, and institutional. About 30% of that non-residential development activity over the past decade has been accommodated within Moncton's industrial district employment areas. Now I turn it back to Donna.
To remember to unmute myself. A little bit about the planning framework that's at the foundation of the work that we're doing. Moncton has a municipal plan that has 9 incredible principles, and I was really happy when I cracked open the municipal plan and see these principles. I look at lots of official plans and municipal plans, and they don't include such a comprehensive list of principles like embracing nature, a principle like celebrating history, another principle that will have a city of more complete neighborhoods, will create beautiful and vibrant spaces. So this is a really terrific foundation for some of the work we're doing. And we have certainly heard from lots of people in our conversations who echo the sentiment that these are very important notions. There is, within the municipal plan, there is a specific strategy that, I'm just going to get the right title of it, that talks about how the city plans, how it guides land use growth and change. And it's called Shaping and sustaining our city. And it presents a citywide big picture for Moncton. And there are 10 parts to that specific a component of the municipal plan called Shaping and Sustaining Our City. And in that, it again reiterates the importance of protecting the natural environment, making the link between land use and transportation, creating great neighborhoods, encouraging a sustainable approach to regional planning, making sure that the rural character is preserved. So again, a terrific foundation in the component of the municipal plan that talks specifically about shaping and sustaining the city. I'm going to turn it back over to Eric to talk specifically about the urban boundary, what that means, how it's defined.
Thank you, Donna. So as part of the broader conversation of understanding and looking at growth over the longer term and how to accommodate that, we really have to first look at the city's urban structure. And so this map here illustrates the municipal boundary of the city and how its urban area, which is defined by the urban boundary, is defined. So this city has a total land area of about 14,000 hectares or about 35,000 acres, of which about 55% is located in the urban area. And this again is the area that's contained by the red line, and depicted by the yellow area shown on the map. So currently the majority of the city's population and housing and employment base, which I spoke to earlier, is located within this urban boundary shown here in the yellow polygons. So the urban boundary is obviously very important in that it helps define the urban area and is ultimately the focus for longer term development, as identified as one of the key strategic priorities, which Donna spoke to earlier. And really the idea here is that with growth over the longer term, it's in the city's best interest to focus development activity within the urban area, utilizing existing services and resources that are currently maintained in that area, and to also maintain the rural character of the rural area moving forward over the longer term. So in looking at the urban structure in more detail, this map sort of helps illustrate some of its core components. The city has a very vibrant and distinct downtown core, which is depicted here in the red color. The city also has a number of mixed-use centers and corridors, which are highlighted in the orange-brown color, which essentially identifies locations for higher densities of development and intensification potential more broadly. And then, of course, there are established and stable neighborhoods, which are identified in the yellow, light orange yellow coloring. The city also has a number of employment areas depicted here in the purple shading, and this includes the Caledonia Business Park, as well as Moncton East and Moncton West employment areas. And these are very important, especially as it relates to accommodating more export-based sectors, such as manufacturing, transportation, and warehousing type functions. So looking forward, one of the components of this analysis ultimately will be to identify opportunities to accommodate future growth, not only with respect to population and housing, but also employment. This map here identifies some of the key infill areas and greenfield growth locations that have been identified that we will be focusing much of our analysis on. With respect to infill areas, which are really opportunities for intensification, largely in the form of higher density residential as well as mixed use uses. They're labeled there A through D. So that includes the Wheeler Boulevard area labeled as A. We have the Carson Drive area identified with the letter B. We have Vaughan Harvey Boulevard, identified as C, and then Ivan Rand Drive, which is the letter D. As far as Greenfield growth locations, much of the Greenfield supply opportunities are located in sort of the more on the periphery locations of the existing city within the urban area. And this includes the North End, identified as 1. Number 2, which is the Vision Lands located in the more central part of the city. We also have the Royal Oaks area labeled as 3, located to the north. And then finally, we have the East End identified as number 4, which incidentally is located at the east end of the urban area. So now we'd like to get into a conversation about our growth projections. This is obviously a very key technical deliverable in this early phase of work. This is ultimately very important into really understanding ultimately the magnitude and quantum and the type of growth and development that we expect to see in Moncton over the next 25 years. And as such, we have prepared some preliminary potential long-term population, housing, and employment growth projections for conversation here this evening. I need to really stress that these are potential, and we really are looking for input from the audience here tonight on your perspectives and thoughts on the 3 growth projections that we have prepared. So we have prepared a medium forecast, which is also labeled as our reference forecast. And then for comparative purposes, we've also provided a low and high growth scenario for discussion purposes. And ultimately, at the conclusion of this work, the results of the analysis are really intended to help guide decision-making as it relates to policy development related to both planning and growth management, which is very much a focus of this exercise, as well as understanding urban land needs over that 25-year time period, as well as master planning and municipal finance implications. So this table here provides a schematic on some of the components of our approach to growth forecasting and modeling. Understandably, there's a whole range of considerations that are anticipated to impact future growth, and that includes demographic, economic, and socioeconomic factors that are going to impact future population, housing, and employment growth levels in the city over the broader term. Much of this really focuses on understanding what the economic drivers of population and employment growth are. This, is obviously a much bigger sort of a theme than just the city. We need to look at this more from a regional context, especially within the greater Moncton context, and really to understand the broader regional growth outlook for the region, especially in those more export-based sectors that will drive employment growth opportunities locally. And so with that, very much the emphasis here is to really understand that as a cornerstone of understanding the labor force, growth potential, and ultimately how those economic opportunities will then translate into net migration levels to the city, at least recognizing that much of that will be a driver of net migration of those under the age of 65, but also recognizing that there will be opportunities to accommodate broader market segments, not just working age population. And we also need to factor in natural increase, births and deaths, and so very much using a cohort forecasting approach combined with a household formation pattern to understand how that future population growth will translate into housing growth over that period. And then ultimately understanding how that growth, both respect to population, housing, and employment, will be accommodated within the city over that 25-year period, and then ultimately identifying future urban land needs. So currently, the focus for tonight's conversation is very much on establishing or helping to establish our population and household and employment growth projections. And ultimately later in the study, we will be then looking at how that growth will be accommodated and ultimately determining future urban land needs for both residential and non-residential development. So obviously a fairly in-depth discussion there, and hopefully that's provided sufficient context for tonight. So in terms of growth drivers, we have a number of them that we've identified to help support the forecasts. The projections that we've identified here, as I mentioned earlier, much of this will be driven by net migration. The long-term net migration is expected to be driven by a number of factors, including Moncton's growing importance as a regional commercial center, not only in retail and food and accommodations and those types of sectors, but as well as related to higher education, health services, public administration. We do expect that the population growth of the 55 plus age group will definitely be a major factor in the population growth that the city is expected to experience over the coming decades. And this will definitely have implication on housing needs for that market, that age cohort. The city's geographic location in the heart of the Atlantic region is also very much a competitive advantage that certainly makes Moncton a very attractive location for many export-based sectors such as manufacturing, as well as for goods movement, especially in the world of e-commerce that we're seeing a significant growth in. Finally, the city also offers quality of life factors, and this is becoming increasingly important in attracting residents to communities. So we'd like to first focus on the draft population projections that we've identified through 2046 for the city. As I'd mentioned earlier, we have prepared 3 in total. The medium or reference scenario is shown in red, and it's essentially sees the city's population growing from 80,600 in 2021 to about 109,000 people by 2046. And this is represents a 35% increase in the population base over that 25-year period, and it represents a 1.2% average annual growth rate annually over that period. The medium reference forecast very much represents a growth rate that overall over that 25 period is very similar to what the city has experienced over the past decade. But it does also represent a forecast where you see relatively stronger growth over the next 10-year period with population growth starting to slow post 2031 for the latter part of the 15-year period through 46. We've also provided 2 alternative scenarios. The high growth scenario is shown in the green line. It basically identifies population of the city growing to 116,000 by 2046, which represents an increase of about 44% from 2021. And again, that is a faster growth rate than what has been achieved historically in the city, about 1.5% average annual rate over that 25-year period. And then finally, the low growth scenario identifies a population of 101,000 by 2046, representing a 25% increase over that 25-year period and an average annual growth rate of 0.9%. And these 3 growth projections very much differ with respect to the assumptions being made on those growth drivers that I mentioned earlier. And so it does provide you some context to the range of potential growth that the city can achieve from a population perspective. The following graph basically provides a summary of the forecast population by age cohort for the reference scenario. It very much illustrates the aging of the population that I spoke to earlier. you can see from this graph that, for example, in the 75 plus age group, that market, the share of that age cohort is going to increase from about 9% in 2021 to about 16% of the population by 2046. So that's a significant increase in the share of those 75 plus as a share of the city's population. Next slide, please. So a part of the growth forecasting work that we have put together is to translate that population growth into a housing forecast. And we've done this by looking at propensity rates and household formation patterns in the city, and how we expect those, the people who are going to be attracted to the city, how they're going to be accommodated with respect to housing. And so you can see from the graph here, again, three separate scenarios presented again based on the three population forecasts that we have identified. The red line again depicts that reference or medium growth scenario. We see the city's housing base increasing from about 34,000 in 2021 to 47,000 by 2046. And that represents about 510 housing units being built annually on average over that 25-year period. In the high growth scenario, that household number by 2046 is quite a bit higher at 50,600, and that would require about 645 units being built annually. And in the low growth scenario, we would see housing increase to about 43,600 by 2046, resulting in an average annual units of about 370 units on average. So this graph here provides a bit more of an incremental forecast to illustrate the housing growth in 5-year periods, in a 5-year increments, I should say, over the 25-year period. This is now based on the reference forecast or the middle forecast that I spoke to earlier. And you can see historically, the city has seen relatively strong housing growth through 2021, but we do see that ramping up in the reference forecast to about 3,600 units over the next 5 years. And then that growth starting to taper down through the forecast period, but still remaining relatively strong compared to the historical average. One thing to note as well is that the housing mix is expected to gradually shift to higher densities. So historically, low density units have accounted for about 58% of housing development. We see that declining to about 41% over the next 25 years. And of course, this will be relatively gradual with a greater and increasing share of both medium and higher density units. And really this speaks to the market needs of an aging population, as well as increasing affordability concerns that will drive demand for smaller and more compact and higher density units as a result. Again, this graph here also illustrates the housing forecast for the reference scenario. Again, the same data as I presented earlier, but just helping illustrate how the existing housing inventory or stock in the city is expected to change by density type over that 25-year period. So you can see that in 2021, about 55% of all housing in the city is of low density typology, and we expect to see that share decline marginally over the 25-year period, falling to about 51% with an increasing share of both medium and largely high density units over that time period. Now, similarly to the population and housing forecasts that we have presented, we've prepared similar projections for employment. Again, looking at 3 scenarios, a low, medium, and high over that same 25-year time horizon. The red line depicts the medium or reference forecast, under which we see the city's employment base increasing from about 54,000 in 2021 to about 66,000 by 2046, which represents a 22% increase in employment over that time period. And that equates to about 480 new jobs in the city on average per year over that time period. You can see that the high growth projection sees the employment base expanding to about 70,000 by 2046. That represents about a 28% increase from the 2021 level. And that would require about 620 new jobs per year on average over that 25-year period. In contrast to low growth scenario, we see employment growing to about 62,500 jobs by 2046, representing about a 15% increase, or equal to about 325 jobs, new jobs per year over that time period. You can see also the trend line in the forecast here, where we see relatively strong growth in the first 10 to 15 years, and then that those lines start to plateau a bit. And that really does speak to the aging of the labor force due to demographic factors, and that will certainly slow, we expect, employment growth rates under all three scenarios over that longer term period. This slide here, again, provides a little more context to the forecast. Again, this is for the reference or medium forecast, providing a breakout of employment by sector over the period, as well as illustrating the relationship between population and employment, which is defined here as the activity rate, which is shown as the red line that runs through the middle of the graph. The activity rate is basically the ratio between employment and population. And so you can see that activity rate has been trending downward, which illustrates essentially that population growth has been higher than employment growth historically in the city, and we do expect that trend to continue, but it will start to stabilize and plateau towards the latter part of the forecast period, with activity rates expected to reach about 61% by 2046. So overall, the growth projections present what we feel is a balanced growth outlook with respect to both population and employment, but recognizing these broader, economic and demographic factors which the city will be facing over the longer term. This graph shows that same employment forecast in 5-year increments with respect to growth over that 25-year period. You can see from the graph, similar to the population forecast that we presented, with the strongest employment growth occurring over the first 10 years, with employment growth starting to decrease with respect to the growth rates during the last 15 years of the forecast. Overall, over that 25-year period, we have worked out, the employment by major sector, which is identified in the legend there. That includes the institutional, industrial, commercial, as well as primary sectors, which are relatively small in the Moncton context, as well as work from home and also no fixed place of work. These are two sectors that have seen growth, higher growth than the others historically, not only in Moncton, but more broadly in the Canadian context. Over the forecast period, we expect almost 1/3 of overall employment growth to be in the commercial sector, about 24% in the institutional sector, followed closely by the industrial sector, accounting for about 23%, and then work at home, representing 8% of employment growth, and no fixed place of work accounting for 12% of the total. Next slide.
Thanks, Eric.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much for that great presentation. Sets a solid context for this conversation part. And we've got a bunch of questions we wanted to put out to the group. And we've divided them into having a conversation first to get your thoughts on the current residential and employment market, and then we'll move into thoughts about projections and potential and growth. So if we could focus now on characterizing the residential market, and then the next part of that question is to characterize the current employment lands market in Moncton. Happy to take comments about employment or residential. And I just open it up. I'm happy to have you use an icon to show that you have a question, raise a hand, or put it in the chat box and I'll read it out, or just put your camera on and wave at the screen. So anything to share right now in the current residential or employment market?
Hi, John.
Bill, I see you've got your hand up, Bill. Yep, go ahead.
So this is more of a comment, Eric. We just did our year-to-date September building permit report, and it was an all-time record with $41 million in construction, primarily related to the new Walmart distribution center. But our year-to-date building totals are about 217. And last year's was an all-time record with 270 million. And it looks like we're going to surpass that this, with what we're seeing for the rest of the year. Are your stats, they seem low on the building construction values? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, we, as far as historical data,
yeah.
Sorry, on non-res?
Yeah, just on the non-res.
Right. Well, our data that we were reporting out on, the 24 million or so average annual was based on data from 2011 through 2020. So that 10-year horizon or period. So we didn't include 2021 in that analysis. Now that's all related sort of to the historical context to this discussion. Ultimately we are very very positive about the short to medium term economic and growth outlook for Moncton, and that's really reflected in those population, housing, and employment growth projections that we've identified, especially over the next 5 to 10 years. And so definitely would like to look at those in more detail to help sort of confirm some of those near-term trends that we're anticipating. So certainly some good metrics there for us to review.
Sure. Yeah, no, I think it's just, and maybe it's the last three, like the last 2 years were all-time records. And I think we're heading into a third year of really, booming construction. How long can that continue is kind of interesting to examine. But anyway, thank you.
There's a question, Bill, just before you go, whether from somebody in the chat box, is it possible to share the building permit stats by geographic sub area for the past 5 years?
We can try to get I will ask Andrew Smith is on board. One of the things we're trying to do with our GIS department is to map development activity, and we're testing some stuff. And I will ask Andrew if we can get that done. And as part of this project, see if we can put that up on Let's Chat Mountain and share it with you and Eric, Donna.
Awesome. Okay, that's great. And that was from somebody in the chat box. So that's great. Thanks, Bill. I'm not seeing an indication of comments to be shared to give us some insights that would characterize the current employment or residential lands. Just give it a quick minute before we go on.
Yeah, Bill mentioned the Walmart distribution center for for Moncton based on the 2021 market statistics on new development activity for non-residential. And certainly that's an area of growth potential, especially as it relates to employment uses in Moncton's industrial areas. Certainly would be very interested to hear from the broader group if there's any other insights or perspectives on that.
See, we have a very shy group of developers and builders on the call. This is unusual in my experience working on planning projects.
There's a few other themes as well, which I think are probably worth exploring. And we certainly will be offline as well, as related to the office market. It's obviously been growing over the last number of years due to sort of the growth in knowledge-based sectors, and certainly be interested in hearing about that potential in Moncton, not only with respect to suburban type development, but also opportunities in the downtown. The retail sector as well, I mean, certainly has been through a challenging period through COVID, and is transforming the landscape, due to e-commerce and trends that were already happening due to economic disruptors and agents of change even prior to COVID, but COVID has certainly accelerated many of these trends that we're seeing. And certainly any insights on the retail sector would be important. Especially within the context, I think, of Moncton, which historically has been a fairly important regional center for retailing activities, whether it be large format retailers and shopping centers.
Okay. I am going to switch over to talk about growth and getting the group's perspective on short, medium, longer term market for housing development in Moncton, and perspectives on the forecasts that were presented. And I'm going to just go down my list of participants and I call out just first name and invite you to turn your mic on just for a minute. And if I don't see your mics coming on, I'll move on to the next few people. So we're focusing on population and housing growth potential, your perspective on short, medium, long-term potential. So on my list in alphabetical order, I've got Albert, and Alvin, and so I invite you to share any of your insights. Go ahead, Anne. There's your mic that's turned on.
Okay, hi. Yeah, I think it's just a lot of information to explore right now. But just talking about the housing growth, of course, I'm executive director of the Downtown Association. So, excuse me, I know the downtown a little bit more, but it's obvious that, there's a great residential component that's being created downtown. And we hope that this is going to be bringing a lot of development in the downtown. Excuse me. But I wonder, and of course, it also ties in with your question before this one here. Just wondering, like, how is this going to, our office buildings are kind of empty right now. There's a lot of, we're hoping that the residential is going to bring in more development, which means more services. But at the same time, I looked at your numbers for people working at home. I don't know if that's quite realistic in our present situation, because there seems to be a lot of workers that are just staying at home, so I'm not sure how you've looked at all that, and if you've taken all that into consideration, but really truly believe that the residential is going to change our downtown. And it's wonderful to see all this residential development happening at this time.
The core. And I think you raise a couple of really good questions, and maybe we could get Eric to weigh in on that, your perspective on the future of the empty office buildings. Eric, is that like a 2-year thing that we're going to suffer through? And also your observations about the work at home. I too found that a little bit interesting, knowing how difficult it was to get our employees back to the office. So.
Yeah, well, this is definitely a timely topic, and not to say, we have all the answers this early on. I think on the office vacancies, certainly I think the worst is sort of behind us. I say that, fairly broadly. Certainly it's not just a Moncton issue. This has been impacting every urban center from here to Vancouver. So I think what we're seeing is we're starting to see some stability returning. Vacancy rates are still, relatively high in most markets, but we are seeing absorption going in the more positive direction, which is encouraging. I think the longer term implications on the office sector are probably real, in the sense that there probably will be more of a hybrid approach to work in sectors that actually can work remotely, and that's not everybody. That's largely focusing on those knowledge-based sectors, and so we do anticipate floor space per worker continuing to decrease, which means that even though there will be growth in these knowledge-based sectors, it means that the floor space needed to accommodate them will be less than in the past. And so that is probably a reality. And so there will be greater opportunities, I think, for residential units, especially ones that accommodate live-work arrangements, so that there are opportunities for people to work remotely, in a more sustained capacity. But that's only possible if they have actually home offices or productive areas at home to work. And so these are all issues that still need to be sort of understood better in terms of longer term trends, but certainly some preliminary conclusions. As far as work at home, I agree that this is a very tricky area to try and quantify. Certainly we have good data historically to understand work at home. That trend, as I had mentioned earlier, has already been growth in this segment over the past 10 to 15 years. And so we do see that continuing to grow as a share of the overall employment base. And we have factored that into our, growth metrics. However, we, certainly will take your comments into consideration and have another look to see, are they balanced, sort of within the context of these broader trends that we were speaking to on remote working. And this is a very challenging area to try and model, especially over a longer term time period, because there's always a tendency to have a bit of a knee-jerk reaction as to what we're experiencing today or even over the past 18 months. But ultimately, what will things look like over that next 5-10 year period and longer term?
Thank you. Just one more comment.
Yep.
I brought that up because I did meet with Chrystia Freeland prior to the election and mentioned that and said, we were advocating to have the larger employers bring back their employees downtown to work. And she said she really made it quite clear that it was, the hybrid model was working very well in the bigger cities, Toronto, Montreal, Calgary, Vancouver, where people were, really loved the fact that they could commute, or they did not have to commute so much. And so she said, you're just going to have to get used to it. This is a thing of the future. So it was kind of worrisome.
That's interesting. That's interesting that she would do such a broad sweep, because what we found is it's very industry specific. It's very sector specific, whether it works or not. So that's very interesting.
So just keep that into your in mind when you're yeah.
Thank you for that. You. Thanks, Anne. Eric, you've got your hand up.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll speak in French. So if your interpretation is not on, je travaille pour l'Université de Moncton. So I'm working with the University of Moncton. So je sais pas si c'est pertinent, mais je vais quand même vous donner en fin de compte un aperçu. On a un nouveau président, un nouveau recteur qui a l'intention de vouloir augmenter la population étudiante de à peu près 1000 étudiants dans les 4-5 prochaines années. Donc, évidemment, toute la question de logement est un peu un stress pour nous, surtout au terme de logement abordable, pour permettre aux étudiants, évidemment, de se loger. Lorsqu'on parle de 1000 étudiants, si on fait une moyenne de 2 par unité de logement, donc on parle de 500 unités de logement nécessaires pour accueillir ces étudiants de l'extérieur. Il faut comprendre aussi que l'Université de Moncton, 70% de sa population étudiante vient du Nouveau-Brunswick. On est à peu près à 30 et 35% de recrutement à l'intérieur même des écoles acadiennes et francophones de la province. Donc, la capacité de grandir dans ce marché-là, pour nous, est très faible. Donc, on va beaucoup recruter au niveau de l'intentional et à l'extérieur de la province. Donc, pour nous, c'est un flux d'étudiants, mais la question demeure où vont-ils loger? Nous avons l'impression que les nouveaux logements qui sont construits à Moncton présentement sont des logements qui sont plus dans le higher end, là, au niveau du prix du loyer. Ceci étant dit, l'université aussi appartient à des terres, appartient aux landowners. On appartient à 200 acres, qui est l'autre côté de la Morton du campus. Et nous sommes vraiment intéressés à travailler avec la ville de Moncton pour développer ces terrains-là. Je pense qu'il y a un projet innovateur qui a été avancé, qui est Shanex. Donc, l'université loue ces terrains à l'entreprise Shanex. Donc, les étudiants peuvent en bénéficier, que ce soit les étudiants en sciences infirmières, les étudiants en travail social, en psychologie, en loisirs. Donc, il y a une façon de faire avec l'entreprise, ce que peut être bénéfique pour l'Université de Moncton et ses étudiants et pour l'entreprise également. Donc, parce que Shanex, c'est une entreprise privée, évidemment, et qui offre un milieu de vie pour les personnes âgées. Donc, évidemment, on a 200 acres, on a une rue prête, la rue de la francophonie, the road is ready. Donc, évidemment, on veut discuter avec la ville pour savoir comment est-ce qu'on va vouloir développer ces terrains-là. C'est-tu du R&D? C'est-tu de la technologie? C'est-tu... Parce qu'évidemment, à l'université, on a des programmes en intelligence artificielle, en AI, en robotique. Donc, il y a un potentiel de croissance là que je n'ai pas nécessairement vu, mais je pense que c'est à nous, comme université, d'approcher la ville et de dire « Hey, nous sommes partenaires, on veut danser avec vous. » Puis, je pense qu'il y a un potentiel là également.
Okay. Thank you very much. I hope everybody was able to locate that interpretation function in their toolbar and flip from English to French or French to English. Eric, were you able to do that? Do you want me to summarize?
Yeah, I got most of it. My apologies. Okay. It wasn't quite working in the beginning, but I think I got, about three quarters of the conversation. So very, very great feedback and happy to respond.
Okay, so let me just summarize in case people were struggling with the flip over. The question was about the university, that they're targeting growth of about 1,000 new students, and they're targeting students internationally, unlike the focus in the past, which has been to focus on Francophone schools. So they're concerned about where those students will be housed, concerned that some of the current housing development is higher end, too expensive. Luckily, the university has about 200 acres around the campus. So, and that they're looking forward to working with the city and other partners to develop those lands. And it sounded like for a mix of businesses and housing. And that is fascinating because there is some phenomenal models with development that's happening around campuses across Canada. And some of the leading ones are UBC, Simon Fraser University. Just about every university is looking at exactly this, looking at lands that they own outside of the academic core and how they can be redeveloped for other uses. So Eric, over to you to talk about opportunities for housing, affordable housing for students and a kind of broader range of uses, employment uses around the campus.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's a very very interesting topic, and certainly an area of great, more broadly growth potential in higher education, and really serving as a catalyst for broader economic opportunities in a community, and really lends itself to sort of capitalizing on those knowledge-based sectors where there is, great opportunity longer term. So I think, there's a number of themes here. One is, for post-secondary institutions to understand their growth potential and where they're going to draw students from. That's a whole other area of study that we could get into ultimately or have a conversation about. But certainly I think it's in the city's interest to really understand what those growth targets are and how many new students will be accommodated, in the city over the coming years in terms of enrollment growth. And one of the challenges that have faced many municipalities with larger post-secondary institutions is where to house these students. There is not a sort of it's less common now to have on-campus residences that are entirely owned and operated by the schools. Certainly, there's a much more of an approach to looking at purpose-built student rentals. And it does speak also to the need for a market choice with respect to affordability. And it's important to be proactive, I think, in this area because there is otherwise the potential for these students to be housed in perhaps stable neighborhoods and low-density housing and competing with other market segments for rental housing. And that may or may not be, the optimal approach to meet longer-term housing needs in a community for students. So definitely many considerations here. I think what's important to understand, though, is that for an urban growth strategy, these students, for the most part, are not permanent residents of Moncton, and so they're not typically captured in census data. And so in more traditional reporting of growth projections for population, many of these students are not captured in our growth metrics. And so that does raise some challenges when considering them because their home or their permanent residency wherever they're from is ultimately where they're included in census compilation and population statistics.
Andrew, you have your hand up. Did you want to weigh in a little bit on what Eric was talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to, say that after this session, there is opportunity to reach out to staff individually, and we're willing to host kind of one-on-one meetings with individual groups. So you choose. So I think there'll be a great opportunity to further that discussion and certainly build upon an existing strong relationship between the city and UTM. Bill, I noticed that you're muted or unmuted right now. I'm not sure if you had a couple of words you wanted to interject as well.
Yeah, no, I thought the gentleman made some really good comments and contributions that I think we need to follow up on. What's interesting, there is a past relationship of the city and the University of Moncton working together. Yeah. It's interesting that the 200 acres that is being referenced is on the north side of Morton Avenue. It's actually in the Vision Lands. It's in the east side of the Vision Lands. Okay. And what's interesting, to the north of this area is Halls Creek Villages. So there's actually infrastructure going through this area to service the neighborhood to the north. But there's probably, like in other Canadian jurisdictions, a need to create more complete neighborhoods that serve both the university community and the community at large, right. Whether it's housing, services, amenities, connectivity, better relationships. And there is a strong Francophone community just developing to the north, new Francophone school. So I see this as a really high potential future growth area that we need to study in our different scenarios. And so the big takeaway for us, I think, Andrew.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Bill. I have a couple of questions in the chat box, and I'm not sure who's best to answer, but are there concerns about the current state of vacancies in Trinity Drive, Mapleton area, and the infrastructure that's already been spent in that area versus spending infrastructure and tax dollars to expand new commercial areas? Not sure if that's a question for the city. Bill, you've got your mic turned on. Do you want to weigh in on that, or is that you, Eric?
Well, it's an urban, can you hear me?
Yeah, we're good.
It's one of the things I think that as the work that Donna, particular Eric and Watson are doing on growth projections and what kind of demand do we have for future employment, industrial, retail, commercial, we're going to have to look at, but we also have to focus on completing neighborhoods as part of urban growth management. So I know that Mapleton, a lot of people raise questions about the Vision Lands and Mapleton Road. It's a major mixed-use corridor. Yeah. There's been about $15 million or more in infrastructure upgrading that road to accommodate developments, a major gateway into the city. So we have to figure out, you know, how to deal with those issues in our growth strategy. And what I see other jurisdictions are doing is, you know, they're encouraging growth in mixed-use corridors, transit-orientated corridors, big box retail areas that once thrived are becoming less vibrant because of what's happening, you know, online shopping, etc.
Yep.
What I'm seeing is a trend where they're repurposing these areas into more mixed-use centers with higher density housing, employment nodes, transit-orientated.
Yeah.
So instead of continuing to sprawl out, there's costs. Like we already have the infrastructure there. We might want to focus on making it work and be completed. The other comment is where we have made major investment in infrastructure, the city probably needs to start to see a return on that investment. And I don't know if you've read the paper this week, people locally, we have probably a $200 million infrastructure deficit across the city with old infrastructure that needs to be renewed. But we also have growth pressures that we also have to, if you saw the growth forecast, there's also a lot of infrastructure required to support that growth. And so what type of infrastructure is that? And we're eventually going to get to that with the growth scenarios. And we're going to have to figure out where do we, what we're going to have to prioritize what we, from a fiscal impact analysis, where do we spend our dollars? It's going to be a challenge. So creating new is not always new opening up new areas also put challenges on the city to be able to focus on renewing the infrastructure. And the article I'm talking about this week, if you saw it, talks about in the North End, there's $27 million worth of stormwater sewer infrastructure that needs to be renewed to prevent existing residential building from being flooded out, basements flooded. There's been just so much growth, okay, and the system's so surcharged. We need to really think about, and I'll stop there.
Okay. Okay.
But that's sort of the issue there, I think.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much for that, Bill. Another question in the chat box. Can you share relevant growth, development, and future plans for Dieppe and Riverview? The comment that it would be helpful to understand background and trends in the greater Moncton area, and would be helpful to have a better understanding of Moncton's advantages and likely development versus adjacent municipalities. Eric, did you collect that as part of the work that the team has done?
We've looked at it more from a broader sort of historical and sort of existing context with respect to development trends, you know, growth rates, We recognize that Moncton's not an island. It's obviously competing with these neighboring municipalities for growth and development, both in housing and for employment as well. So we don't like ultimately in the reporting we will provide more of a regional sort of a context to that conversation.
Okay.
We don't have access to detailed metrics on like opportunities for future growth. That level of information is fairly high level.
Okay. The future, another question in the chat box, and then I'm going to come back to my list of participants. The future development map that we've shown in the presentation, it shows development north of Royal Oaks. Why is the area north of TCH, I'm going to assume that's Trans-Canada Highway, and south of Pine Tree on Elmwood Drive not considered future development? So I'm going to just jump back to that map. And Eric, or I'm not sure if that's Andrew, would you be best to answer that? So future development map shows development north of Royal Oak. North of Royal Oak. I'm not sure, Harry, if you want to come on and clarify the comment with the map on the screen.
Well, I think, I mean, I can.
Oh,
sorry, go ahead.
No, what I was saying is that zone 3 there.
Yep.
I said it was north of Royal Oaks. It may be Royal Oaks that they've got indicated there. It's too small on my screen. I can't make out what it is.
Okay.
It is Oaks. Sorry.
So they're indicating this whole area as development, yet they skip over everything from the Trans-Canada up to Pine Tree, which is closer to the city center that for development purposes. I'm just trying to grasp
understand.
What's going on.
Yeah, understand the map. Andrew, I think your mic is on. Go ahead.
I'm not sure if Bill, you want to add to this as well, but I know there's some kind of historical development trends in that area and some decisions regarding some of the mini park development up there and also the school in that area. So that has kind of pushed pressure northward and extending our urban boundary. However, the thrust in the current municipal plan is to retain the status quo with that urban boundary. And it still is a challenge and quite expensive to the city to service some of those areas south of that kind of pocket, despite looking like a peninsula per se in the urban boundary. I'm not sure if you have anything to add to that as well, Bill.
Well, no, I just to emphasize the boundary of this urban growth strategy. One of the exercises is to look at the urban boundary. I think Eric gave some background on it earlier tonight about how much land do we have with all of the land within the urban lands within the urban boundary. I guess, will that meet our needs for future growth and development? If we look at infilling in existing areas, achieving densification objectives in the downtown, and then accommodating growth within planned growth areas, the 4 areas. And then I guess part of tonight's exercise is to also hear all other alternatives, but the urban boundary is one thing. There's a whole chapter in the municipal plan on growth management. And there's a number of policies there. And so outside the urban boundary, there is a major policy to preserve the rural area, the rural character, and not to kind of, hold the line. And part of holding the line is, and I'd like to get a little more, background on this to everyone, but we have about a $200 million infrastructure deficit inside the urban boundary we spend about $20 to $30 million a year trying to renew infrastructure. But in addition to that, we have major growth pressures, areas opening up that need significant transportation upgrades and other kinds of infrastructure to support the demand for growth. And we've got to find new ways to fund that. And we're trying to use development charges. And so that's the exercise. How can we continue to grow, but as well, manage our, the existing services, and ideally, if we can avoid, expanding into areas where we need to even extend more services beyond the urban boundary,
okay.
That's what we're trying to figure out through this process.
Okay.
How to best manage growth and development.
Okay, thanks, Bill. Coming up on 7:20, and we're happy to stay on as long as we have conversation. I want to make sure that, like we've talked about a little bit on housing population, and we also wanted to know if people had any opinion on employment growth potential. I want to keep going down through my list just to see if that unlodges anybody wanting to share some comments. And so when I go down my list, next I have Bernie and then Bill. And then we've just heard from Harry, Joe, or John, or Joseph. And then Julie or Caitlin. Kevin, I know you've asked some questions. And that was Wayne. Kevin, if you have other questions, or Mark. Phil, Steve. And I have another Wayne. As Andrew mentioned a few minutes ago, we are also happy to have other offline conversations with any developer, builder, community stakeholder group, anybody that wants to connect with Andrew and express an interest in having a follow-up conversation. We're completely open to that.
Yeah, that's correct. I'll just send a note through the chat. If you don't already have my direct email, you can reach out to me and we can schedule something over the next few weeks.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I'm not seeing anything else coming in the chat box. In terms of next steps, we are going to be posting a summary of everything we've learned over the last couple of months. We're not attributing any specific thing that we've heard to an individual who said it. We're going to be summarizing common themes and common things that we've heard through the conversations. We'll be posting that before the end of the year. We are launching a citywide online survey in the next couple of weeks. Watson & Associates will be developing more work on the growth forecasts. We will be holding a second round of engagement in the winter and having another online survey in the early part of next year. Is there anything else from your perspective, Andrew, that should be covered in the next steps before I ask Bill to wrap the meeting up on the city's behalf?
No, nothing from my end.
Okay. So Bill, do you want to just close the meeting on the city's behalf, and then I'll end the meeting for everybody?
Sure.
Go ahead, Bill.
Again, just as Andrew said, if anyone wants to have any one-on-one sessions with the city to further discuss different scenarios, please reach out to us. like to thank everyone for participating, and we'll continue to put all the information from this initiative on the city's Let's Chat Mountain website, so you can follow the progress of the urban growth strategy. So back to you, Donna. Thanks.
Okay, thanks so much, Bill. So thanks everybody for carving out a bit of time this evening to join the conversation. All this information will be posted to the project webpage, including the slide deck. So the recording and the slide deck, so you can pour over it in more detail. And please follow up if you'd like another conversation. So thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you very much.